Hey everybody, and welcome to Database Camp. My name is Sarah, and in today's video I'm going to be continuing my reading on racism in America. I just wanted to remind you guys that this book is available for free. You can download it. I'm going to post the link down below, so if you're interested in reading this book on your own time, you could go ahead and download it for free and read it at your leisure. I also wanted to post the link of my first video that I've made of this series of racism in America. So if you wanted to know a little bit more background, if you wanted to know what inspired me to make this series, and also if you wanted to hear me reading the foreword, you could go ahead and click on that link. I'll also have it down below in the description box. So in case you wanted a little bit more information, that's the video that you're going to be able to find it in. So today we're going to read the 6th excerpt in this book, and it's titled The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America by Kahlil Gibran Muhammad. So just a little bit of background before we begin. Following the 1890 census, the first to gather statistical data on African Americans born after slavery, a damaging cautionary tale arose about the threat Black people posed. Excessive arrest rates and overrepresentation in northern prisons were seen by many white people as proof of Black people's inferiority. Chronicling emerging notions of Black people as a dangerous race of criminals, Kahlil Gibran Muhammad reveals the pernicious influence of the idea of Black criminality. Here he analyzes how officials in the late 19th century used statistics to conclude that while the failures of white people resulted from social problems needing amelioration, those of Black people had to do with inherent racial characteristics and were therefore pathological. With the 1896 publication of Frederick L. Hoffman's Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the African Negro, a tour de force in the annals of post-emancipation writing on the Negro problem, statistical data on Black criminality secured a permanent place in modern race relations discourse in the United States for the first time. His first published article, Vital Statistics of the Negro, appeared in the April 1892 edition of The Arena, a Boston-based progressive journal. Hoffman's article was the 4th entry on the Negro problem published by the journal subsequent to Harvard scientist Nathaniel Scholler's 3 1890 articles. In Vital Statistics, Hoffman expanded on Francis Amana Walker's thesis that previous investigators had overestimated the future colored population. Rather than analyze unreliable birth rate data as others had, the records were spotty and poorly kept. Hoffman turned to mortuary reports for 8 southern cities. He found that on average, Blacks died at nearly twice the rate as whites. Although environmental conditions were a factor for all groups living in poverty, the 2 main causes of high mortality among Blacks were consumption and venereal diseases, which he linked to their inferior constitution and gross immorality. Hoffman's italics. The data included statistics from the U.S. Army during the Civil War, clearly showed that more Blacks than whites died of tuberculosis. In all these cases, Blacks and whites faced the same external conditions, according to the U.S. Surgeon General, from whom Hoffman quoted directly in an 1889 report, demonstrating that the difference was the result of race proclivity to disease and death. In the expert opinion of the nation's foremost medical authority and Hoffman, Healthcare discrimination, plus the physical, emotional, and psychological toll of racial oppression, apparently had nothing to do with Black health and mortality disparities. Although Hoffman liked to declare otherwise, it seemed the data did not speak for themselves, since there was more than one way to interpret them. As for venereal disease mortality, Hoffman had no actual data. Instead, he asserted that any physician who practiced among the colored people would attest that as many as 75% of them were cursed with a sexually transmitted disease. He followed up the anecdotal evidence with more death tables showing that across the board, Black babies and Black women died at higher rates than their white peers. From his perspective, every statistic or expert testimony was scientific proof of inferiority and degeneration. Thus we reach the conclusion that the colored race is showing every sign of an undermined constitution, a diseased manhood and womanhood, in short, all the indications of a race on the road to extinction. In his first article, Hoffman was on his way to shaping racial statistics into a powerful, full-blown narrative of Black self-destruction, racial decay, and the futility of reform. He asked rhetorically, why waste the nation's resources on a vanishing race? With the forces of logic, reason, and statistics on his side, Hoffman appeared to foreclose the possibility of seeing Blacks' situation any other way. Yet within the following year, in 1893, he presented a completely opposite interpretation of a high mortality problem among whites. In their case, he blamed society and called for economic intervention. Suicide, the most literal act of self-destruction any individual can commit, was on the rise in the United States, and Hoffman collected mortality statistics to prove it. Suicide and Modern Civilization, also published in the Arena, was, according to Hoffman, the first time the suicide statistics for American states and cities had ever been presented. Across the country, especially in the urban north, where state and county agencies kept the best records, suicides had risen dramatically since the 1860s. Massachusetts, the epitome of America's Puritan past and industrial future, recorded over 900 suicides in the last half of the 1880s, compared to 394 self-killings in the first half of the 1860s, a 130% increase. Connecticut's rising suicide rate, Hoffman found, was even more startling, growing 216% over a similar period. Always striking in its grandeur, New York City held the dubious honor of being the suicide capital of America in the late 1880s, recording 1,188 suicides that represented a 52% increase over the 1870s. Philadelphia and Baltimore had far fewer suicides, but saw the rate of voluntary destruction increase by roughly 70% over the same period. If every suicide and attempted suicide were actually recorded, Hoffman wrote in a dire tone, the army of those who seek in suicide a relief from earthly troubles would assume alarming proportions. The plain but impressive language of statistics had given a picture of the darkest side of modern life. The stresses and strains of modern civilization were to blame, Hoffman wrote, and had contributed to increasing rates of insanity and brain diseases. According to an expert Hoffman cited, these individuals were victims not of their own vices, but of the state of society into which the individual is thrown. Hoffman agreed, insisting that the total amount of misery and vice prevailing in a given community was a manifestation of something fundamentally wrong in society. The study of statistics of suicide, madness, and crime is one of the utmost importance to any society when such abnormal conditions are on the increase, he wrote in a plea for reform. When such an increase has been proved to exist, it is the duty of society to leave nothing undone until the evil has been checked or been brought under control. The health of the people must come before the wealth of the people. Hoffman concluded that we must be far from truly civilized as long as we permit to exist, or accept as inevitable, conditions which year after year drive an increasing army of unfortunates to madness, crime, or suicide. It is the diseased notion of modern life, almost equal to being a religious conviction, that material advancement and prosperity are the end, the aim, and general purpose of human life. It is the struggle of the masses against the classes. Hoffman interpreted White's self-destructive behavior as a consequence of a diseased society, not of a diseased manhood and womanhood. White criminality was a response to economic inequality rather than a response to a race proclivity. On the white side of the color line, it would take nothing short of emergency measures to save modern civilization from itself. Hoffman's emergent advocacy was bidirectional. On the one hand, he interpreted the data on black mortality as a race problem, a call to do nothing. On the other hand, he interpreted the data on white mortality as a social problem, a call to do everything possible, to leave nothing undone. Taking one extreme position, then the other, Hoffman was becoming an outspoken partisan in debates about America's future well before he began writing Race Traits. Historian Lundy Braun writes that he shared with other progressive-era reformers a faith in the expertise of middle-class professionals to influence the culture of knowledge production in the United States and to shape policies of the state and civil society in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His tremendous influence in these areas was defined in part by his choice and the decisions of many others to see blacks' problems as uniquely their own, just as he chose to see whites' struggles for mastery as society's problem. In a society where the ideology of white supremacy was ascendant, Hoffman saw no inconsistency in his thinking. In his earliest writings, he was not a social Darwinist in the sense that he thought helping the weak was antithetical to social progress and nature's plan. The problem was helping a race of people outside the pale of civilization who had, according to his interpretation of the latest data, proven themselves to be permanently inferior to all whites, including European immigrants like himself. The city Negro brought into direct competition with the white race has usually but one avenue out of his dilemma: the road to prison or to an early grave. He wrote in an article following the suicide report, "In this racial Darwinist formulation, permanent racial inequality and premature death among blacks was a scientifically sound solution to the Negro problem, and a progressive means to economic equality among whites through a more effective use of social resources." In relation to the recurrent economic depressions of the late 19th century and related immigration and labor problems among whites, Hoffman's career was propelled by his attempt to outflank late 19th century racial liberals with novel racial statistics. Non-discrimination laws in the 1880s forced insurance companies to offer blacks the same benefits for the same premiums that were guaranteed to whites. Prudential balked at the new laws and hired Hoffman in 1894 because of his expertise in the field of black mortality. The company wanted him to prove on actuarial grounds that discriminating against blacks was justifiable. Prudential and Hoffman aimed to turn the racial fantasy of the extinction hypothesis into hard scientific numbers that could be deployed for the purposes of profit and prejudice. It was in this context that Hoffman made his most original contribution to the analysis of new racial demographic data by zeroing in on black criminality. 2 years later, he would elevate it to the national stage of race relations discourse in an effort to silence Northern racial liberals who had not yet been swayed into accepting black inferiority through biological evidence such as small brains and diseased bodies. Hoffman's decision to focus explicitly on black criminality was likely influenced by his encounter with a debate between two prison doctors on why black convicts died in prison at much higher rates than white convicts. In the February 3, 1894 edition of The Medical News, R. M. Cunningham, a former Alabama prison physician, reported that the Negro mortality was 3 times greater than white, based on examination of some 2,500 convicts, over several years ending in 1890. Although, according to Cunningham, the site of investigation was a first, since no comparative racial study and explanation of mortality differences among prisoners had hitherto been attempted, the results confirmed previous research. The well-known facts of blacks' physical deficiency and asymmetrical development, their small thoracic regions versus their large stomachs and penises, predisposed them to diseases such as tuberculosis. All one has to do is to see 300 or 400 Negroes naked in a large bathhouse, and then step through a door and see 75 or 100 white men in the same condition to convince him of the correctness of this view. The statistical fact of black men dying in prison was written into the observed evidence of inferiority found in the body. Like life in the army, prison life was supposedly free of racism, eliminating it as a factor in the mortality differences. This is certainly true at the place whence the foregoing statistics were obtained. That 85% of the prisoners were black, when before emancipation 99% of Alabama's prisoners were white, and that more than 5 times as many Negroes as whites were committed for crime, had nothing to do with discrimination. According to Cunningham, Alabama's laws were impartially administered so far as race is concerned. These disparities were also observable in northern prisons where racial equality was a given. He explained as yet another proof that blacks were at the root of their own demise. In rebuttal, M. V. Ball, a prison doctor at Eastern State Penitentiary, which housed Philadelphia's convicted felons, wrote that Cunningham's data were accurate, but his interpretations was all wrong. Black prisoners were indeed far more likely than whites to die of tuberculosis in a Pennsylvania prison, as in other northern prisons, but the causes were related to childhood poverty, unsanitary living conditions, and poor hygiene. In the early years are sown the seeds of tuberculosis, Ball wrote, which require but the confinement of prison to mature and develop. He added that mortality statistics did not generally take into account social distinctions, therefore masking the effects of poverty on populations that disproportionately suffered from it. Ball cited as an example data from the New York Board of Health for various tenement districts that revealed that childhood mortality rates among struggling Italian immigrants were similar to those of struggling blacks, and were much higher than for the city in general. Make the conditions favorable for the Negro from childhood up, and then first can we say that blacks are more disease-prone. The criminal nature of the Negro must be viewed in the same light, Ball continued, before ascribing the overrepresentation of blacks in Pennsylvania's prisons, or in Georgia's, or in Mississippi's, to their inferiority. Racial prejudice must be taken into account. In the South, where lynch law is most commonly dealt out to the Negro, we might attempt to ascribe this greater criminality to lack of fair treatment, and prejudice on the part of the white man, but in the North we are supposed to be exempt from this accusation. Although Ball hesitated to say that Northern racism was potentially as important to assessing black criminality as Southern racism, he was certain that the current state of statistical analysis left much to be desired. In criminal statistics, as in medical statistics, we do not compare classes. Until we do, he concluded, I would refer the differences to environmental conditions rather than to physical distinctions. Until the sociological factor is studied and taken into account, the so-called hereditary and racial characteristics as witnessed in the adult are liable to lead to wrong conclusions. If there was one moment when Hoffman, the young, ambitious, German-born statistical maven, had to step back and either reconsider his interpretation of racial statistics or charge ahead, fortifying his ideas with more forceful language and emphasis, this was the moment. This debate did not begin as his fight, but it most certainly ended that way when he published a rejoinder to Ball's article in the September 22, 1894 issue of The Medical News. Hoffman attacked Ball's every point with no fewer than 12 proofs of counter, data and counter testimony. Most of the data and expert opinions he cited were recycled from his 1892 article, but this time his language was far more pointed and expressive, revealing a strong desire to eliminate any possible reason for interpreting the data in social terms or in a manner similar to his own position on white suicide and criminality. His strongest and most consistent argument against Ball was to unequivocally assert the total absence of racism and discrimination as determinative of the health and welfare of blacks in American society, because the Negro is placed under exactly the same conditions, social and economic, as the white race. There was no way to explain the mortality and criminality differences other than their race proclivity to disease and death. Any city in the South will show that year after year, for the past 20 years, blacks died at rates 25% to 100% higher than whites. Records from the Army presented similar data as proof, so convincing that it will be hardly necessary to add anything further in support of the theory of distinct race characteristics. Moreover, the Surgeon General and recognized authority, Hoffman continued, had come to the same conclusion, in such an emphatic manner. Even the British troops in the West Indies outlived blacks in an environment where blacks had an advantage. As life in the West Indian islands is to the Negro a paradise on earth, being an outdoor rural life with little manual labor, he wrote, echoing Schuyler's words about Haiti and Jamaica. Back in the United States, actuarial data by all the life insurance companies confirmed that blacks on average died 10 to 12 years younger, in their early 20s, than whites, with their economic incentive to seek healthy clients regardless of race and to perform routine medical examinations. Prudential Insurance Company's 50% higher payout to the beneficiaries of black policyholders was yet another proof of the permanency of racial difference. Hoffman continued, writing in an ignorant tone to show that Ball had missed or had refused to acknowledge what was plain for all to see. Need more proof be brought forward to maintain the assertion that the Negro and the white man differ fundamentally? I could quote authority after authority to prove that such is really a fact. That Hoffman felt compelled to go to such lengths to refute Ball, given that it was not his research that had been directly challenged, demonstrates how passionately he believed that demographic evidence was the smoking gun for which so many racial scientists and race relations writers, such as Schuyler, had been looking. But this was not just about one individual's pursuit of scientific certainty in solving the Negro problem. Hoffman's was not the only voice of white absolution for the sins of Americans' founding fathers and mothers, nor was his the only voice speaking of black degeneracy, black savagery, and black extinction in the 1890s. He kept extremely good company in this regard, from scientists to academics, to journalists, to religious leaders, to American statesmen. Rather, this was about how one individual could make a difference in redefining a scientific problem and in pushing the boundaries of conventional knowledge and understanding into new research areas. At this time, social scientists were attempting to raise their academic profile by becoming professionalized, by founding academic journals, and by adopting empirical methods to give their findings the veneer of scientific certainty like those of their senior colleagues in the natural sciences. With a real knack for spotting emerging statistical trends in the United States, and with a little help from his European counterparts, Hoffman identified key areas of demographic research, sometimes based on entirely new data that others had not yet noted or had only casually considered. With black crime like white suicide, Hoffman took Cunningham's and Ball's lead into the realm of black prison and arrest statistics and put himself on the cusp of yet another original contribution. Left with one final proof in order to dismiss all of Ball's interpretations, Hoffman cited a French physician's 1889 study that tied the physical differences between West Indians and the white man to distinct social aptitudes, noting that a similar study of the Negro criminal in this country would lead to similar conclusions. This was Hoffman's first published comment on the Negro criminal, demonstrating his dedication to searching for the data and to filling what was an obvious void in debates about the scientific origins of black disease, death, and self-destruction. A far more robust and pioneering crime analysis was to follow in the book. In the meantime, Hoffman haphazardly noted, without citing dates or using tables, wide racial disparities in Chicago, arrest rates, and Pennsylvania prison rates. Unlike work on black mortality, the large-scale study of black criminality from the statistical standpoint was mostly uncharted territory. Anecdotal, anthropological, and journalistic assessments of black criminality had informed 19th century popular opinion and social practices. Colonial laws targeted unsupervised gatherings of enslaved men and women and conspiring free blacks to ensure against black uprisings. Antebellum blacks were often subject to discriminatory policing, even as they suffered violence periodically at the hands of native-born white and immigrant mobs in northern cities. Since 9 out of 10 blacks were enslaved until the late 19th century, the scientific measure of black criminality first awaited freedom, then reliable data. As late as 1893, as indicated by the absence of any mention of blacks in one of the first textbooks on what would later be considered American criminology, an introduction to the study of the dependent, defective, and delinquent classes by University of Chicago social scientist Charles R. Henderson, quantitative research on black criminality had not yet begun. Given how much Hoffman seemed to delight in pioneering the compilation and presentation of vital statistics on a national scale, he probably consulted Henderson's book before proceeding with his own study. The likelihood is further demonstrated by noting just how tightly drawn was the intellectual circle that encompassed Hoffman, Henderson, and others. In the second edition of the Dependent, Defective, and Delinquent Classes, Henderson wrote on the Negro Factor for the first time and cited Hoffman's Race Traits, which had been published in 1896, 3 years after the first edition. Another important report on the national crime situation that lacked statistical data on black criminality appeared the same year as Henderson's first edition, and Hoffman likely read it. The report was written by his colleague at the U.S. Bureau of Labor, Carroll D. White, from whom Hoffman had obtained data before writing his first race article. Wright linked crime to unemployment and the exploitation of unskilled and uneducated workers. His only reference to African Americans was a slim mention in a discussion of general trends in industrial nations in the 19th century, where He argued crime rose as a natural consequence of the transition from feudalism to wage labor and from slavery to freedom. It seems likely that Hoffman noted the absence of vital statistics on black crime in Wright's article, then studied Wright's argument that preventing white crime required better protection of the white working class against the ravages of economic depressions in the industrial marketplace. The shutting down of the mines of Pennsylvania, or the reduction of work therein, Wright wrote, throws large bodies of men out of employment. Crime is the result, and the criminal statistics swell into columns that make us believe that our social fabric is on the verge of ruin. Wright's evocative language reflects the growing compassion of many American social scientists who, in the wake of a national recession in the 1890s, began to argue against social Darwinism. They were also arguing against the emerging biological determinism of European criminal anthropology, which was gaining popularity due to the efforts of its foremost promoter, Cesare Lombroso, an Italian prison inspector. On the origins and solution to white criminality, Wright may have influenced Hoffman directly, given the tone and tenor of his suicide article. Wright and Hoffman shared the same school of thought. Society and the government had a responsibility, both argued, to protect the health and welfare of the white citizenry. Otherwise, crime, disease, and death were inevitable results. As Wright put it, the health of the workers of a community is essential to their material prosperity, and the health of a community has much to do with the volume of crime. Within the general population, among Anglo-Americans and New European immigrants, the problems of disease, death, and self-destruction were rooted in industrialization and modern civilization. Harry Vrooman expressed similar views and was also a contributor to The Arena. A social writer and organizer of the Progressive Labor Party, Vrooman argued that the whole problem of crime as today expressed in society is summed up in the problem of poverty. We have churches enough, schools enough, moral sentiment enough to regenerate the world in a decade. Were it not for the awful pressure brought to bear on 9/10 of the human race, which all but forces them to be vicious. Moreover, society owed the great army of unfortunates not just economic security but goodwill that encouraged respect for the ethical code and an obligation to sustain the social order. In other words, sympathy and compassion for working-class white Americans were as important as living wages and human working conditions. Vrooman took his analysis one step further by attributing part of the blame for Bowery crimes, a reference to a New York City immigrant slum, and wage slavery to Northern greed during the Reconstruction period. Under Negro domination, he wrote, a black horde of practical savages, controlled by Yankee plutocrats, plundered the South. Notwithstanding the challenge to universal white economic mobility posed by free black labor, Hoffman, Wright, and other progressives believed that at the nexus of crime and whiteness there was only a class problem. There was no race problem. Ball agreed entirely with the conclusion that race was not the determinant factor in white mortality and white criminality, but he believed the same held true for blacks. In response to Hoffman's latest entry in what had turned into a nearly year-long debate in the pages of the Medical News, Ball insisted for the second time, though much more forcefully, that mortality and crime statistics in and of themselves could not be trusted. Figures in themselves mean nothing. They must be carefully analyzed and studied in connection with social conditions, without taking into account a host of known sociological factors. Statistics were an insufficient basis upon which to draw conclusions, and could easily become misrepresentations of reality. Repeating a cliché, Ball wrote, "There are three kinds of lies, someone has said: white lies, black lies, and statistics." From Ball's perspective, the statistical lies told by Hoffman, Cunningham, and others had little to do with the actual mortality and prison data, which he admitted were not in dispute. There was no doubt that more blacks than whites died of tuberculosis and went to prison, but explaining why was the essential problem. Ball rejected the racial meaning Hoffman obsessively gave to the statistics. He balked at Hoffman's omission of other kinds of demographic data that showed rates of mortality among the Irish and Italians living in impoverished neighborhoods of the urban north as similar to rates among blacks. According to Ball, even the 1890 census data, when read with a different interpretive lens, showed that foreign-born whites and the children born of foreigners have the same death rate as the colored, because they often dwell in the same surroundings and are under the same economic conditions. Even when mortality differences seem to point to racial differences, Ball found not biology, but more subtle environmental influences related to housing and hygiene. The extreme housing differences between whites of the wealthy classes and blacks who lived in the alleys back of their mansions accounted for huge disparities in mortality. In regard to crime statistics, environmental factors such as the misconduct and biases of criminal justice officials were similarly as determinative. Ball continued, all lawbreakers are not sent to prison, and the more influential the criminal, the less likelihood of conviction. The police court investigation in New York City shows us that morals cannot be determined by the number of arrests, and that the most disorderly element in New York City was most exempt from police interference. Ball was citing the findings of the Lexow Commission of 1894, the first blue ribbon investigation of police corruption and violence in American history, which made headlines at the same time his article appeared. According to historian Marilyn Johnson, the New York State Legislature launched an investigation of the New York Police Department after a series of high-profile corruption scandals. The investigation produced more than 10,000 pages of testimony that detailed multiple cases of police graft, vice protection, racketeering, and election fraud. The investigation was nicknamed the Clubbers Brigade, to highlight the connection between corruption and brutality by police officers, 100 of whom appeared before the commission to explain their equal number of assault convictions. Like Ball, a lawyer for the commission noted the discriminatory effects of police misconduct. Those in the humbler walks of life were subjected to appalling outrages. They were abused, clubbed, and imprisoned, and even convicted of crime on false testimony by police and their accomplices. The poor, ignorant foreigner residing on the Great East Side of the city has been especially subjected to a brutal and infamous rule by the police. For Ball, then, the circumstances affecting disease and criminality among the poor, ignorant foreigner were likely to be as active in the Negro. Moreover, the tendency to compare blacks to the whole white race, with its 4 or 5 social divisions, exaggerated the racial distinctiveness of blacks, rendering invisible the commonality of poverty and ignorance among various subgroups. Such a method is not scientific, he unequivocally asserted to Hoffman. Thus, before we can call characteristics racial and dependent upon distinct organic differences, we must eliminate the sociologic factor. But Hoffman hardly looked back as he wrote Race Traits and Tendencies of the American Negro. In this full-length treatise on the racial deterioration of black people in America, published 2 years later, he never explicitly acknowledged Ball's warnings. While he made a few veiled references to the environmental argument of some authors, he insisted that the evidence of race deterioration was indisputable, and that no difference of interpretation seems possible. With the notable addition of more mortality data, which he claimed had never been published or had never been duly considered by those who believe so firmly in the all-powerful effect of the milieu, much of the book was an expanded version of his previous articles. What was new in the book, however, was of no minor consequence. His major innovation was in presenting for the first time a statistical study of the Negro criminal, whereas in slavery it was a well-known fact that neither crime nor pauperism existed. He began, in freedom, the latest data positively proved otherwise. The 1890 census, according to Hoffman, showed 24,277 Negro criminals out of the nation's 82,329 total prisoners, about 30% and nearly 3 times the number of black men and women in the general population, 12%. Although black men constituted more than 90% of all colored prisoners, just over 22,000, both sexes were most likely to be incarcerated for violence, the most serious of all crimes. Out of nearly 7,000 men imprisoned for homicide, just over a third, 2,512, were black men. Black women made up nearly 6 in 10 female prisoners convicted of murder, representing 229 women prisoners out of 393. For rape, the most atrocious of all crimes, black men composed 41% of convicts. For property offenses, arson ranked at the top among black men and women as a proportion of the total, at 46% and 61% respectively. Hoffman thus praised the wisdom of insurers in restricting the amount of fire insurance obtainable by colored persons. If the information in the book spoke for itself, as Hoffman frequently claimed, it seemed at times to have been too soft-spoken. The message apparently was worth repeating. Black criminality justified black prescription. Regarding lynching, for example, Hoffman interpreted press accounts of rape as justifying mob violence, even as he admitted that there was no statistical evidence to link the two. The evidence on this point is not such as would recommend itself to an investigation of this kind, in which official data are the main reliance, he wrote. Instead, he supplemented newspaper evidence with the opinion of those most competent to judge, including the Virginian historian Philip Alexander Bruce, whose influential 1889 book, The Plantation Negro as a Free Man, was one of the most heavily cited post-bellum race studies. Bruce, quoted by Hoffman, described the rape of white women by black men as indescribably beastly and loathsome, without peer in the whole extent of the natural history of the most bestial and ferocious animals. Although Bruce claimed to be impartial, dispassionate, and free of a personal connection to slavery, his book in general, and his chapter on black criminality in particular, represented the standard repackaging of pro-slavery beliefs for a post-bellum audience. By relying on such experts, Hoffman combined crime statistics with a well-crafted white supremacist narrative to shape the reading of black criminality while trying to minimize the appearance of doing so. Thus, the innovative and enduring significance of Hoffman's crime analysis was not only in presenting the data for the first time, but also in setting the terms and shaping the frame of analysis. Table after table of arrest and prison statistics from cities across the nation such as Chicago, Philadelphia, Louisville, and Charleston, South Carolina, and from states including New Jersey and Pennsylvania, Hoffman proclaimed, all confirm the census data and show without exception that the criminality of the Negro exceeds that of any other race of any numerical importance in this country. When the Negro learns to respect life, property, and chastity until he learns to believe in the value of a personal morality operating in his daily life, the criminal tendencies will increase. Although anecdotally, Black criminality had already become a popular measure of Black progress and potential among postbellum writers, in Hoffman's seminal statistical formulation, it secured a more fundamental and permanent role in future race relations discourse. It was now nearly impossible to read Black crime statistics as symptomatic of the failed promises of racial equality in the wake of the Civil War and Reconstruction, or, as Ball had suggested, to see crime beyond race as a sociological consequence of economic and social inequality in the industrial age. The construction of an avenue along which such thinking might have traveled was postponed indefinitely. Even suicide among blacks, according to Hoffman, and in contrast to suicide among whites, was strictly viewed as pathological, in most cases to escape the consequences of his crimes. Ultimately, by framing Black criminality as a key measure of Black inferiority in the same way that his peers and predecessors had done through anatomical measurements and mortality data, Hoffman wrote crime into race and centered it at the heart of the Negro problem. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to leave your thoughts down below in the comments. I would love to hear from you guys. Please do make sure that you're subscribed, and make sure to give this video a like, and also feel free to check out all the other videos that I've posted already about this book. Bye guys.